So, in today's lesson, we will be talking about the strong past tense for I-Verbs. And in the next lesson as well, because this time it is a little bit more complex, but don't worry, we will go through this, as always, step by step. But first, we need to talk about the ta-verbs. You see, long ago, when the languages were still common Eldarin, the verb augmenting suffix ta was a separate morpheme, a causative morpheme, which means the subject is causing someone or something else to do stuff. And this is why they often are transitive verbs. If you remember, that means they need an object. In Sindarin, the ta has been absorbed into the verbs, and the only times we see traces of this is in the past tense and very rarely in gerunds. The ta will be dropped from the verb root, and these words will be treated like I-Verbs instead of I-Verbs. And this is why we are covering them now in the I-Verb lessons. So, now back to the strong past. This tense is simply made by changing the root of the verb instead of adding a morpheme to it. And that is why it is called strong past tense. And it is used with the ta-verbs and I-Verbs. Luckily, for the I-Verbs, we do not need to worry about transitive versus intransitive. Now, if there is a prefix on the verb root, the prefix is added onto the conjugated verb. For example, ahar becomes adagor, which means it did something again. Or ubet becomes uebent, which means it couldn't say. But if the prefix was added back in common Eldarin, the vowel is not prefixed onto the main roots. But don't worry, those are easy to spot, because those roots have more than one syllable. For example, govan, which becomes govon, and not guavon, which means it met. Similar, echat becomes echant, and not edagant, which means it fashioned. So, if we have I-verb stems that end in a stop, which would be b, d, or g, we have a nasal suffix n, but this time it is not that easy, sorry, but also not that complicated, because this suffix mutates the consonant it is attached to. Let's look at this small table here. We have the endings b, d, g, plus the nasalization n. The normal result will be b plus n becomes mp, d plus n becomes nt, and g plus n becomes nk. Now, if it is intervocalic, which means if it is between two vowels, b plus n becomes m, d plus n becomes n, and g plus n becomes ng. Easy enough. Yet, there's one other change we need to talk about. Similar to the Attic dialect perfect tense, look at the reduplication. In Sindarin, if the root starts with a consonant, and remember, the root is usually monosyllabic, so we only have one vowel in there. We are taking this vowel of the root. By the way, the root is called sondoma in the singular and sondomar in a plural. We are adding this vowel before the root. This causes the following consonant, which again is the initial consonant of the stem, to be put under so-called soft mutation or lenition. Now, a quick linguistic excursion here. In Welsh, which is a common Celtic language, there is a grammatical process called soft mutation, where the initial consonant of a word changes to a softer sound. For example, P becomes B, G becomes G, B becomes V, and D becomes D. It is primarily triggered by preceding words like prepositions, the definite article, or possessive pronouns, and affecting 9 specific initial letters. Now, in Sindarin, much like in Welsh, it is a grammatical function, a phonetic flow. The initial voiceless stops, which would be P, T, and K, become voiced, B, T, and G. The initial voice stops, on the other hand, which would be B, T, G, become fricatives, so V, Th, and G just vanishes completely. And this is triggered by preceding vowels, in particular the article E. Let's look at some examples. So, we have payer, which is word, becomes bayer when we have the E article in front of it, so the word. Then we have telhior becomes idelior. Car becomes igar. Bar becomes ivar. Dagor becomes ithagor. Galenas becomes alenas. Melon becomes velon. Seil becomes heil. And Huhn becomes Huhn. And now back to the strong past tense. Here, for example, we have the stem hep, which becomes a hemp, which means it kept. Now, let us look at this step by step. First, we have one syllable, so it is monosyllabic. It starts with h. This becomes h. Next, we have the e, which is again the vowel of this monosyllabic stem, which is attached at the front. So we have a he. Next, the stem ends in b. We need to add the nasalization suffix n to it. And b plus n, if it is not in the vocalic, becomes mp. And that's it, a hemp, it kept. Next, mat becomes avant. Here we have a similar process. We have the R in front. We have the change from m to v. And we have the d plus n becoming nt. Next, gat, which becomes ant, which means it caught. Here the g vanishes and the d plus n becomes nt. Now, the last one is a little bit more tricky. Here we have talk becomes udunk, which means it led. Here we must know that the original root is tuk, with an u and a k. So in the present tense it becomes talk, but the o is originally u, and the final k becomes a g. So, with that in mind, we have a completely different stem here. So, sometimes it is slightly more complex. And the last point for this lesson, it would be pretty useful to make other forms besides it. So for this, we add E to the end, which, if you remember, causes a E affection in the vowels preceding it. And, important, it makes the nasal element, the N, plus the preceding B, D or K, intervocalic. And then we are adding the pronoun suffix onto the E. So, let's look at 3 examples and finishing this lesson. So, a hemp becomes a hemmin, I kept. Again, we already know why a hair. The is because it is now intervocalic. We are adding E to it. And lastly, the N is the personal pronoun E suffix. Next, avant. Here, remember, we have now the E mutation, aka E affection. So it becomes evenif. And lastly, udung becomes udingik, you let. Now, in the next lesson, we will be talking about the I-Verbs ending in continuance. But for now, that is all.